Sarah Martinez stepped off the dusty train at Pine Ridge Station, clutching her worn leather suitcase with trembling hands. The small frontier town stretched before her like something from a nightmare. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling under the harsh mountain sun. She had traveled 3 days from Boston to reach this remote place, following the promise of a teaching position that would help her escape her past. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like a miracle. A one-room schoolhouse in the Colorado mountains needed a teacher willing to work for modest pay. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was how isolated Pine Ridge truly was. The nearest city lay 200 miles away, and winter was approaching fast. Sarah walked down the main street, her city boots clicking against the wooden sidewalks. Cowboys and miners stopped their conversations to stare at her. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with the dignity her mother had taught her. But inside she felt completely lost. The men's eyes followed her every step, making her skin crawl with unease. She found the boarding house where she was supposed to stay. Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman with gray hair pulled back tightly, showed her to a small room on the second floor. The walls were thin, and Sarah could hear every sound from the saloon next door. Laughter, shouting, and the occasional gunshot echoed through the night. That first evening, Sarah sat by her window and wrote in her diary. She described the mountains that surrounded the town like giant guardians, their peaks already white with early snow. She wrote about the fear that gnawed at her stomach, and the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her. But she also wrote about hope. This was her chance to start over, to build a new life far from the scandal that had destroyed her reputation back east. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden building with broken windows and a roof that leaked in 3 places. Sarah spent her first week cleaning and preparing for her students. She scrubbed the floors, mended books, and tried to make the place feel welcoming. The work kept her busy, but it couldn't quiet the whispers she heard whenever she walked through town. On her 3rd day, she encountered Jake Morrison for the first time. He was loading supplies into his wagon outside the general store when their eyes met. Jake stood tall and lean, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and honest labor. His brown eyes held kindness but also wariness. He tipped his hat politely and helped her carry her heavy bag of school supplies. "You're the new teacher," he said simply. His voice was deep and calm, unlike the rough shouting she heard from other men in town. "I'm Jake Morrison. I run cattle up in the high country." Sarah felt something stir inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in months. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Morrison. I'm Sarah Martinez." They talked for only a few minutes, but Sarah found herself thinking about him for the rest of the day. There was something different about Jake, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since leaving Boston. The school children arrived on Monday morning, 12 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old. They were curious about their new teacher, testing her patience and authority with typical childhood mischief. Sarah discovered she loved teaching, loved watching their faces light up when they understood a difficult concept. But as the days passed, she began to notice things that worried her. Some of the older boys whispered among themselves and glanced at her with expressions that made her uncomfortable. She heard fragments of conversations about her past, rumors that someone had brought from back east. The scandal that had driven her from Boston seemed to be following her even here. One evening, as she walked home from the schoolhouse, Sarah realized she was being followed. 3 men kept pace behind her, their boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. She quickened her steps, her heart pounding with fear. The men laughed and called out crude comments, but she didn't turn around. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming to Pine Ridge. The isolation that had seemed like protection now felt like a trap. She was alone among strangers, with nowhere to run if things became dangerous. Outside her window, wolves howled in the distant mountains. The sound sent chills down her spine and reminded her how far she was from civilization. But Sarah Martinez was stronger than she knew, and she was determined to make this new life work no matter what challenges lay ahead. The morning brought news that changed everything in Pine Ridge. Sarah was preparing lessons when she heard horses thundering down the main street. Through her classroom window, she watched a group of rough-looking men ride into town. They weren't ordinary cowboys or miners. These men wore their guns low on their hips and had the hard faces of outlaws. The leader was a man called Black Pete Garrison, though Sarah didn't learn his name until later. He was tall and mean-looking, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. His gang of 6 men spread out through the town like a disease, taking over the saloon and making demands of the local shopkeepers. By noon, everyone in Pine Ridge knew that trouble had arrived. The gang had robbed a bank 3 towns over and killed a sheriff in the process. They were running from the law and had decided Pine Ridge was the perfect place to hide until things cooled down. The town was isolated, had no sheriff of its own, and the nearest lawman was days away. Sarah dismissed her students early that day, telling them to go straight home and stay inside. She could see the fear in their young faces as they hurried past the saloon where the outlaws had set up camp. The sound of breaking glass and wild laughter filled the air as the gang helped themselves to whatever they wanted. That evening, Sarah was walking to the boarding house when one of the outlaws stepped out of the shadows. He was a thin man with yellowed teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey. "Well, well," he said, blocking her path. "Ain't you a pretty little thing? I bet you're that school teacher everyone's been talking about." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again. "Now don't be unfriendly," he said with a nasty grin. "Me and the boys have been on the trail for weeks. We could use some entertainment." Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice cut through the darkness. The lady said, "No, friend. I suggest you respect that." Jake Morrison stepped into the lamplight, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. The outlaw's eyes narrowed as he sized up this new threat. Jake wasn't the biggest man in town, but he carried himself with quiet confidence that made smart men think twice. "This ain't your business." "Cowboy," the outlaw snarled. "When a lady's being bothered in my town, it becomes my business," Jake replied calmly. His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Then the outlaw spat in the dirt and backed down. "This ain't over," he muttered before disappearing back into the saloon. Jake walked Sarah safely to the boarding house, but neither of them spoke much. They both knew this was just the beginning of their troubles. The outlaws weren't going anywhere soon, and they had already marked Sarah as someone they wanted. Over the next few days, the situation in Pine Ridge grew worse. The gang terrorized the townspeople, taking whatever they wanted and threatening anyone who complained. They demanded free drinks at the saloon, food from the restaurant, and supplies from the general store. The shopkeepers had no choice but to comply. Black Pete himself took special interest in Sarah. He would stand outside the schoolhouse during lessons, watching her through the windows with hungry eyes. Sometimes he would tip his hat mockingly when she glanced his way. The children were too frightened to concentrate on their studies, and several parents stopped sending their kids to school altogether. Sarah felt like a trapped animal. She couldn't leave town because the gang controlled the roads, and she couldn't hide because Pine Ridge was too small. Every day brought new fears and fresh humiliation, as the outlaws made it clear she was their prize. Jake tried to help when he could, but he was careful not to provoke an open confrontation. He knew that 1 man against 6 was suicide, no matter how fast he was with a gun. Instead, he watched and waited, looking for an opportunity to turn the tables. The townspeople were of little help. Most were too scared to stand up to the gang, and a few seemed to enjoy watching the proud school teacher brought low. They whispered among themselves about her past troubles in Boston, suggesting she was getting what she deserved. One night, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of destruction from the saloon below. Glass broke, furniture crashed, and men laughed with cruel pleasure. She knew it was only a matter of time before their patience ran out and they came for her directly. She thought about her options. She could try to escape on foot through the mountains, but winter was coming and she would likely freeze to death. She could send a message for help, but the nearest law was too far away to arrive in time. She could try to reason with Black Pete, but she had seen the look in his eyes and knew he was beyond reasoning. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah made a decision. She would not run, and she would not surrender. Whatever happened, she would face it with dignity. She had survived scandal and heartbreak before. She would find a way to survive this too. But deep in her heart, she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. And the only person in Pine Ridge who seemed willing to stand up to the outlaws was Jake Morrison. The question was whether one cowboy's courage would be enough to save her from the wolves that were closing in. Black Pete's patience finally ran out on a cold Thursday morning. Sarah was teaching her few remaining students when the schoolhouse door crashed open. 3 outlaws walked in like they owned the place, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. The children gasped and huddled together in fear. "School's out," announced the thin outlaw who had bothered Sarah before. His name was Snake Williams, and he grinned as he spoke. "Boss wants to have a word with the pretty teacher." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Please leave. You're frightening the children." Snake laughed and moved closer. "The children can go home. It's you we want." Before Sarah could respond, young Tommy Peterson, only 8 years old, stood up from his desk. "You leave Miss Martinez alone," he shouted with the bravery that only children possess. Snake's face darkened. He raised his hand to strike the boy, but Sarah quickly stepped between them. "Don't you dare touch him," she said firmly. "Tommy, take the other children and go home. Now." The children scrambled for the door, but Sarah knew their escape only made her situation worse. Now she was alone with 3 dangerous men, and no one would witness what happened next. "That's better," Snake said, his voice dripping with menace. "Now you're going to come with us, nice and quiet like. The boss has been very patient, but his patience has limits." Sarah backed toward her desk, her mind racing. She knew that once they got her to the saloon, she would be completely at their mercy. "I won't go anywhere with you," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "That ain't really your choice, lady," said one of the other outlaws. They began to close in on her, their intentions clear. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Jake Morrison stepped into the schoolhouse, his presence filling the small room. He carried his hat in one hand, and his other hand hung loose near his gun. "Gentlemen," he said politely, as if he were greeting friends, "I believe you're trespassing on school property." Snake spun around, his hand moving toward his weapon. "I told you before, Cowboy. This ain't your business." "Funny thing about that," Jake replied, his voice calm as still water. "I happen to be on the school board. That makes this very much my business." Sarah had never heard about any school board, but she realized Jake was buying time, looking for an advantage. The 3 outlaws spread out, trying to surround him. Jake noticed their movement and shifted slightly, keeping his back to the wall. 3 against 1, Snake observed with a nasty smile. "I like those odds." "Then you're not very good at math," Jake said quietly. "See, you boys have been so busy terrorizing women and children, you forgot something important." "What's that?" Snake demanded. "You forgot that real men don't much like bullies." As if summoned by his words, more figures appeared in the doorway. Old Pete Hansen from the livery stable stepped in first, carrying an ancient shotgun. Behind him came Doc Williams with his hunting rifle, then Bill Murphy from the general store with a pistol in his shaking hands. Snake's confidence wavered as he realized the odds had suddenly changed. These weren't professional gunfighters, but they were angry men defending their town and their teacher. "Now then," Jake continued in that same calm voice, "I suggest you boys walk out of here real peaceful-like and tell your boss that Miss Martinez is under the protection of this town." For a moment, Sarah thought it might actually work. But Snake was too stupid or too proud to back down. His hand darted for his gun, and suddenly the schoolhouse exploded into violence. Jake's pistol appeared in his hand like magic, faster than Sarah's eyes could follow. Snake's gun had barely cleared leather when Jake's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The other 2 outlaws tried to draw, but found themselves facing the business end of Old Pete's shotgun and Doc Williams's rifle. They froze, their hands halfway to their guns. "Smart choice," Jake said, his smoking pistol still trained on the wounded Snake. "Now pick up your friend and get out. Tell Black Pete that if he wants Miss Martinez, he'll have to go through all of us." The outlaws helped Snake to his feet and stumbled toward the door. Snake was cursing and bleeding, but he was alive. As they reached the doorway, he turned back with murder in his eyes. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot. The boss will burn this whole town down before he lets you make fools of us." After they left, Sarah sank into her chair, her legs suddenly weak. The townsmen gathered around, their faces grim but determined. She realized that something had changed in Pine Ridge. The good people were finally ready to fight back. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at each man in turn. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need for thanks," Old Pete said gruffly. "Should have done this days ago." Jake holstered his gun and moved to the window, watching the outlaws stumble back toward the saloon. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "Black Pete won't let this stand. He'll come with all his men next time." Doc Williams nodded grimly. "Then we'd better be ready for them." Sarah looked around at the faces of these brave men who had risked their lives for her. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the wood stove in the corner. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, she truly felt like she belonged somewhere. But Jake was right. This was just the beginning. Black Pete wouldn't forgive this humiliation, and when he struck back, it would be with everything he had. The real battle was still to come. Black Pete's rage shook the windows of the saloon when his wounded men told him what had happened at the schoolhouse. Sarah could hear his shouting from her room at the boarding house, and the sound made her blood run cold. She had seen angry men before, but this was different. This was the fury of a killer who had been publicly humiliated. Within an hour, Jake Morrison appeared at the boarding house with a plan. He gathered Sarah and the other townspeople in the back room of Murphy's general store, where they could talk without being overheard by the outlaws. "They'll come for us tonight," Jake said without preamble. "Black Pete can't afford to look weak in front of his men. He'll want to make an example of everyone who stood against him." Old Pete Hansen spat tobacco juice into a can. "Let them come. We showed them today that we ain't afraid." "Being brave and being smart are two different things," Jake replied. "We got lucky today. Snake Williams is fast, but he's not the fastest gun in that gang. Black Pete himself is supposed to be lightning quick, and he's killed more men than we've got bullets." Sarah felt the weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. "This is all my fault," she said quietly. "You're all in danger because of me. Maybe I should just give myself up to them." The response was immediate and forceful. Every man in the room spoke at once, telling her that wasn't even a possibility they would consider. Jake's voice cut through the others. "Don't even think about it," he said firmly. "What happens to you happens to all of us now. We stand together or we fall together." Doc Williams cleared his throat. "Jake's right about tonight. They'll come hard and fast. Probably try to burn us out or pick us off one by one. We need a plan." Jake spread a rough map of the town on the counter. "The saloon is here, and they've been keeping their horses behind it. Most of the gang will come straight down Main Street, but they might send someone around back to cut off our escape routes." Over the next hour, they planned their defense. Jake would position himself in the church bell tower with his rifle, where he could see the whole town. Old Pete and Bill Murphy would barricade themselves in the general store, which had the thickest walls and the best view of the street. Doc Williams would take the schoolhouse, and Sarah would stay safe in the boarding house basement. "What about Mrs. Henderson and the other women?" Sarah asked. "Already taken care of," Jake replied. "They're all gathered at the widow Thompson's place on the far side of town. If things go bad, that's where you need to run." As darkness fell, Pine Ridge became a ghost town. Windows were shuttered, doors were locked, and the only lights came from the saloon where the outlaws were drinking and planning their attack. Sarah crouched in the boarding house basement, a small pistol that Jake had given her clutched in her trembling hands. The attack came just after midnight. Sarah heard the thundering of horses' hooves on the wooden street, followed by wild shouting and the crash of breaking glass. Someone was throwing rocks through windows, trying to flush out the defenders. Then the shooting started. The first shots came from the church tower as Jake opened fire on the mounted outlaws. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot carefully aimed. Sarah heard a man scream and the sound of a horse crashing to the ground. The outlaws returned fire, their bullets splintering wood and shattering glass. From the general store came the boom of Old Pete's shotgun, followed by more screaming from the street. The battle was fierce but brief, lasting only a few minutes before the surviving outlaws retreated back to the saloon. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah could hear her own heart beating like a drum. She waited in the basement for what felt like hours before Jake's voice called down to her. "It's over for now," he said as he helped her up the stairs. "We hurt them bad, but they're not finished yet." Outside, the street was littered with broken glass and splintered wood. 2 outlaws lay dead in the dirt, and bloodstains showed where others had been wounded. The defenders had won the first round, but everyone knew it wasn't over. "How many are left?" Sarah asked. 4, counting Black Pete," Jake replied grimly. "But they're the 4 most dangerous ones." Over the next 2 days, Pine Ridge became a battleground. The outlaws tried different tactics, sometimes attacking in broad daylight, sometimes creeping around at night. They set fires that the townspeople had to put out. They poisoned the well at the north end of town, and they took shots at anyone who showed themselves on the street. But the townspeople fought back with determination, born of desperation. They knew that surrender meant death or worse, so they held their positions and returned fire whenever they could. Jake seemed to be everywhere at once, moving from building to building, coordinating their defense and keeping everyone's spirits up. Sarah found herself changing during those terrible days. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train was being replaced by someone stronger and more determined. She helped tend wounds, carried ammunition to the defenders, and even took her turn standing watch. On the third night, Jake came to find her in the basement where she was reloading cartridges for the rifles. He looked exhausted, his clothes torn and dirty from crawling through buildings and dodging bullets. "We can't keep this up much longer," he said quietly. "We're running low on ammunition and the men are getting tired." Black Pete knows it too. He'll make his final push soon. Sarah looked up from her work. "What can I do to help?" Jake studied her face in the lamplight. "There might be a way to end this, but it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've tried yet." "Tell me," she said simply. "Black Pete wants you more than anything else. If we could use that against him, get him separated from his men somehow." Sarah understood immediately. "You want to use me as bait." "I want to give you the chance to end this nightmare," Jake corrected. "But only if you're willing. I won't force you into anything." Sarah thought about the children who couldn't go to school because of the outlaws. She thought about the townspeople who had risked their lives to protect her. She thought about Jake himself, who had stood up to 6 killers because it was the right thing to do. "Tell me your plan," she said. Jake's plan was simple but terrifying. Sarah would appear to surrender herself to Black Pete, drawing him and his remaining men away from the safety of the saloon. Once they were in the open, the townspeople would have their best chance to end the siege once and for all. "The old mine shaft at the edge of town," Jake explained as they went over the details. "It's got only one way in and out. If we can get them trapped in there, we can finish this." Sarah's mouth was dry as dust. "And if something goes wrong?" "Then we'll all go down fighting," Jake said honestly. "But at least the women and children will have a chance to escape." The next morning, Sarah walked slowly down Main Street carrying a white cloth tied to a stick. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the saloon where Black Pete and his 3 remaining men were holed up. She had never been so frightened in her life, but she forced herself to keep walking. Black Pete emerged from the saloon when he saw her coming. He was a big man with cruel eyes and hands that had killed many people. Behind him came his surviving gang members, all of them watching Sarah with hungry expressions. "Well, well," Black Pete said with a nasty grin. "The little schoolmarm finally sees sense. Come to surrender yourself, have you?" Sarah stopped 20 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to run if necessary. "I'm tired of hiding," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Tired of good people getting hurt because of me." "Smart girl," Black Pete said, taking a step closer. "But surrender ain't quite that simple. You cost me 3 good men and made me look like a fool. That's going to require some payment." "What kind of payment?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Black Pete's grin became even more unpleasant. "Well now, that depends on how cooperative you are. Play nice and maybe I'll let some of these townspeople live when we're done here." Sarah felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand. But not here in the middle of town. Too many people watching." Black Pete laughed. "Modest, are we?" "Fair enough. I know just the place. Boys, get the horses. We're taking a little ride." Everything was going according to plan, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. As the outlaws saddled their horses, she caught a glimpse of movement in the church tower. Jake was in position with his rifle, ready to follow them at a distance. The ride to the old mine took 15 minutes. Black Pete rode beside Sarah, occasionally reaching over to touch her arm in a way that made her skin crawl. His men rode behind them, laughing and making crude jokes about what would happen when they reached their destination. The mine entrance was a black hole carved into the side of the mountain. Broken equipment and old timbers lay scattered around the opening like the bones of some ancient creature. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but it was also the perfect place to die if something went wrong. "This'll do nicely," Black Pete said as he dismounted. "Private and quiet, just like you wanted." Sarah climbed down from her horse, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. She had to get all 4 men into the mine shaft before Jake and the others could make their move. "It's cold out here," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Could we go inside where it's warmer?" Black Pete's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Of course, my dear. Right this way." The mine shaft stretched back into darkness, supported by rotting wooden beams that creaked ominously in the wind. Sarah walked slowly, buying time for Jake to get into position. Behind her, she could hear the outlaws' spurs jingling on the rocky floor. "This is far enough," Black Pete said when they were about 50 feet inside the mine. "Now then, let's talk about that payment I mentioned." Sarah turned to face him, her hand moving slowly toward the small pistol hidden in her coat. "Actually," she said, "I think you're the one who's going to pay." Black Pete's expression changed from lust to suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Before Sarah could answer, Jake's voice echoed from the mine entrance. "It's over, Black Pete. You're surrounded." The outlaws spun toward the entrance, their hands flying to their guns. But Jake wasn't alone. Old Pete Hansen and Doc Williams stood beside him, their weapons trained on the trapped men. "4 against 4, Black Pete snarled. "I still like my chances." "Then you can't count," Jake replied calmly. "Sarah, get down." Sarah dropped to the ground just as the shooting started. The mine shaft erupted in thunder and lightning as guns blazed in the confined space. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls and the air filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Black Pete was fast, faster than anyone Sarah had ever seen. His gun appeared in his hand like magic and his first shot knocked old Pete backwards. But Jake was faster. His bullet took Black Pete in the chest before the outlaw could fire a second time. The other outlaws tried to fight, but they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Doc Williams' rifle boomed twice and then there was silence except for the ringing in Sarah's ears. When the smoke cleared, all 4 outlaws lay dead on the mine floor. Old Pete was wounded but alive, cursing and demanding someone help him to his feet. Jake was bleeding from a bullet graze on his arm, but he was already moving to check on the others. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake helped her to her feet, his strong hands gentle despite the violence they had just witnessed. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." As they walked out of the mine into the clean mountain air, Sarah felt like she was being reborn. The nightmare that had gripped Pine Ridge for weeks was finally ended. Black Pete Garrison and his gang would never hurt anyone again. But more than that, Sarah realized she had found something she had never expected to find in this remote mountain town. She had found courage she didn't know she possessed, friends who would risk everything for her, and perhaps most importantly, she had found a man who saw her worth when the rest of the world had turned away. The wolves were finally dead, and she was no longer alone. Spring came early to Pine Ridge that year, as if the mountain itself was celebrating the end of the long nightmare. Snow melted from the peaks in rushing waterfalls, wildflowers bloomed in the meadows, and the town slowly came back to life. The boarding house was repaired, new glass was installed in broken windows, and the saloon was cleaned up and reopened under new management. Sarah stood in her classroom, watching her students work on their arithmetic lessons. All the children had returned to school, and several new families had moved to town after hearing how the community had stood together against the outlaws. The schoolhouse itself had been expanded with a new room and better equipment, paid for by donations from grateful townspeople. It had been 6 months since the showdown at the mine, and Sarah barely recognized the frightened woman who had stepped off the train with nothing but a battered suitcase and broken dreams. That woman had been running from her past, ashamed of a scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Boston. This woman was a respected member of a community that valued her for who she was, not who she had been. The scandal itself seemed laughably small now. She had been engaged to a wealthy merchant's son, who had turned out to be already married. When the truth came out, society had blamed her for not knowing, for somehow allowing herself to be deceived. Her teaching position had been lost, her friends had abandoned her, and her family had been too embarrassed to support her. But Pine Ridge didn't care about Boston society or its cruel judgments. Here she was the brave teacher who had helped save the town. Here she was valued for her intelligence, her kindness, and her courage. The past that had once defined her no longer mattered. Through the classroom window, she could see Jake Morrison loading supplies into his wagon outside the general store. He looked up and caught her watching, then tipped his hat with a smile that made her heart flutter. Their relationship had grown slowly and carefully over the winter months, built on mutual respect and shared experiences rather than empty promises and pretty words. Jake had never asked about her past, never demanded explanations for the rumors that had followed her west. He judged her by her actions, not by gossip and speculation. In return, Sarah had learned about his own struggles. His ranch was small and times were often hard, but he worked with honest pride and treated everyone fairly, regardless of their station in life. After school that day, Sarah walked to Murphy's general store to buy supplies for the community dinner they were planning. The whole town gathered once a month now, sharing food and stories and celebrating their survival. It was old Pete Hansen's idea, though he gruffly denied any sentimental motives. Just makes sense to keep track of everybody, he would say whenever anyone thanked him. Make sure the wolves ain't coming back. But everyone knew the real reason. The siege had shown them how much they needed each other, how much stronger they were when they stood together. The monthly dinners were their way of keeping that spirit alive. As Sarah was paying for her purchases, Bill Murphy cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Martinez, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. My wife and I were wondering. Well, we heard that you and Jake Morrison have been spending a lot of time together." Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm. "We've become good friends, Mr. Murphy." "Friends, yes," Bill said with a knowing smile. "The thing is, my wife thinks Jake's going to ask you to marry him soon. She wanted me to find out if you'd be staying in Pine Ridge or if you might be thinking about moving on." The question caught Sarah off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. Small towns were interested in everyone's business, and her relationship with Jake had not gone unnoticed. "I haven't made any decisions about the future," she said honestly, "but I can't imagine leaving Pine Ridge. This is my home now." Bill's face lit up with relief. "That's wonderful news. We were all worried that you might get tired of our little town and head back east where there's more civilization." Sarah laughed at the idea. "Mr. Murphy, I've seen civilization. I'll take Pine Ridge any day." That evening, Sarah was walking home from the schoolhouse when Jake fell into step beside her. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the town settling down for the night. Children called to each other from their yards. Someone was playing a harmonica on their front porch, and the evening breeze carried the scent of cooking food and wood smoke. "Sarah," Jake said finally, "there's something I need to talk to you about." She felt her heart begin to race, though she tried to keep her expression calm. "What is it, Jake?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his brown eyes serious in the fading light. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since last fall, about what happened with Black Pete's gang, about how close we came to losing everything." Sarah nodded, remembering those terrifying days when death had seemed certain. "It made me realize how precious life is," Jake continued, "how important it is not to waste time when you find someone, worth fighting for." Her breath caught in her throat. She had hoped for this moment but had never quite believed it would come. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I'm not a rich man, Sarah. I can't offer you fancy things or a life of luxury, but I can offer you my heart, my protection, and a love that will last as long as I draw breath." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small but beautiful diamond. "Sarah Martinez, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to her eyes as she looked at this good, honest man who had risked everything to save her. The ring wasn't expensive, but it represented something more valuable than all the wealth in Boston. It represented a future built on love and respect, a partnership between equals. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder. "Yes, Jake Morrison. I will marry you." Jake's face broke into a grin as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her gently, and Sarah felt the last pieces of her broken past finally heal. The wedding took place 2 months later in the Pine Ridge Church, with the whole town in attendance. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, which Mrs. Henderson had helped her alter to fit properly. Jake wore his best suit and looked more nervous than he had facing down 6 armed outlaws. Old Pete Hansen gave Sarah away, grumbling the whole time about sentimental nonsense while secretly wiping tears from his eyes. Doc Williams performed the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister before he became a doctor. Even the children from Sarah's class were there, giggling and throwing wildflowers as the happy couple walked down the aisle. After the ceremony, there was a celebration that lasted well into the night. The whole town contributed food and music, and people danced in the street under the stars. Sarah had never felt so happy or so loved. This was what family felt like, she realized. Not the cold disapproval she had known in Boston, but the warm acceptance of people who valued her for who she truly was. As the evening wound down, Jake and Sarah found themselves alone on the porch of their new home. Jake had built a small addition to his ranch house, creating a cozy space that would be perfect for the family they hoped to have someday. "Any regrets?" Jake asked softly, taking her hand in his. Sarah looked out at the mountains that surrounded their valley, their peaks silver in the moonlight. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, The pain and fear and loneliness that had driven her west, all of it had led to this moment, to this man, to this life she could never have imagined when she first stepped off that dusty train. None, she said firmly, not a single one. In the distance, a wolf howled from the high country, but the sound no longer frightened her. She was no longer alone among wolves. She was home, surrounded by love and protected by the courage of good people. The scared, broken woman who had fled Boston was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger and happier than she had ever dreamed of being. As Jake led her inside their home, Sarah smiled at the thought of the children she would teach tomorrow, the community dinners she would help organize, and the life she would build with this brave, gentle man who had saved her in every way that mattered. The wolves could howl all they wanted. She was exactly where she belonged,